Welcome to Totally Awesome Films, and in this episode we're going to talk about Airplane 2, the sequel. It's got the same plot as Airplane. It's got the same cast. It even has the same jokes.
Jimmy, you like it when Scraps holds onto your leg and rubs up and down?
Airplane 2, the sequel, is basically the same movie as Airplane, except that it takes place in space and has a homicidal robot in it.
I have the strangest feeling we've been through this exact same thing before.
Airplane 2, the sequel, is the direct follow-up to Airplane, which is arguably the funniest movie of all time. And from the moment you start that movie, you're hit by a barrage of joke after joke after joke, and you're left rolling in laughter. Well, if you had such a great time watching Airplane that all you want is more of the same, Airplane 2 is exactly what you need. It is literally just more of the same. Exactly more of the same. And while Airplane was making fun of the airport disaster films, this film may be making fun of all those science fiction movies that came out after the success of Star Wars. Now, when Airplane 2, the sequel, came out in theaters, it was a critical and box office disaster, with critics saying that it was a soulless cash grab capitalizing on the success of Airplane. And, well, that's exactly what it was. It is now over 45 years after both films have been released, and we know exactly what we're getting into when we see both films. And we have no illusions that Airplane 2 is going to be some epic story. Today, Airplane 2 works as a companion to the first Airplane. Because if you had a good time watching Airplane and pretty much want more of the same, Airplane 2, the sequel, stands as a nice alternative, completely fun and wacky movie that always makes us laugh. It continues the fun and laughter of the first movie, and that's why I absolutely love it. And plus, it has William Shatner in it. Due to the success of the first Airplane, Paramount Studios pretty much demanded a sequel. However, the Zaz trio of David Zucker, Jim Abrams, and Jerry Zucker declined to do a sequel, saying that they did every joke they could think of and had nowhere else to take the sequel. So Paramount Pictures decided to make a sequel anyway without the Zaz team. They hired Ken Finkleman to write and direct the sequel, and Ken Finkleman was a Hollywood journeyman television writer who was basically tasked by Paramount to write the movie. And interestingly, he was also asked to write another infamous sequel to a hit film. He also wrote Grease 2. And after he turned in the script, the studios were very satisfied and tasked him to direct Airplane 2. And while this film had a fairly disappointing box office, Ken Finkleman would go on to a fairly successful Hollywood career, even creating the hit TV show, The Newsroom. The Zaz trio themselves remain completely uninvolved. And to this day, all three members, Jerry Zucker, Jim Abrams, and David Zucker, state that they have not seen a frame of this movie. I was 12 years old when this movie was released, and I remember being very excited for it. And even as kids, my younger sister and I were huge fans of Airplane, and so we watched the first Airplane movie probably over 20 times, and then watched the Police Squad TV show when it came out, since Police Squad was directed by the comedy trio of Jerry Zucker, Jim Abrams, and David Zucker, and this film came out in December of 1982. And my sister and I made our father take us to see this on opening night. And we were so excited to see it, and I admit, we did have a good time, and it was funny, although I vividly remember both of us thinking that it was far inferior to the original. First, I was really weirded out that the film takes place in space. It's like, that was an interesting choice. And second, it was exactly the plot of the first movie, with that odd exception that it takes place in space. And back then, I had no idea that this movie was made by a very different team than the people who made the first Airplane movie. I didn't find that out until very recently. And so for the past 40 years, I simply assumed that this movie was made by the Zaz trio. I had no idea that Zucker, Abrams, and Zucker were not involved in the making of Airplane 2. In fact, I made an odd assumption that the brilliant filmmakers of the first Airplane movie were not simply doing a cash grab, but rather making a very clever and astute commentary on sequels, and how sequels often do nothing but retread the plot points of the original film. I assumed that this sequel was a meta-commentary about how sequels are in fact rehashed copies of the original without any artistic nor creative merit. Well, it turns out that this was not a meta-commentary on cash grab sequels, but was a cash grab sequel itself, the very thing I thought they were making fun of. Now, one notable element from the first Airplane that is missing is Dr. Rumack, played by Leslie Nielsen, who single-handedly stole the show in a movie jam-packed with scene stealers. The absence of Leslie Nielsen is certainly felt. His presence was such an important part of that first movie. But he was in the Police Squad TV show, and in a few years, we're going to see a lot more of him in the sequel to Police Squad, the Naked Gun series. However, Nielsen's absence is compensated for by a great new cast member. It is here we get William Shatner, Captain Kirk himself, playing this movie's version of Rex Kramer, who was played brilliantly by Robert Stack in the last movie. And I was already a diehard Star Trek fan at this time. I'd just seen Star Trek II: The Wrath of Khan, and I was a fan of the original Star Trek original series, so it was nice seeing what to me was a classic TV star.
Beeping and flashing, they're flashing, and they're beeping, I can't stand it anymore!
Now remember, the whole joke about the first airplane movie was that it took celebrities who were previously associated with being very serious dramatic actors and placed them for the first time in wacky comedic roles. Well, William Shatner certainly fits into that profile. Until this movie, he was mostly known for being very serious and an overly dramatic actor. And this movie showed that he had a sense of humor. And from here, like Leslie Nielsen, William Shatner will also slowly transform his image into that of a hilarious comedian, showing that he is incredibly funny, has a sense of humor, and most importantly, proved that he can laugh at himself. Another thing I appreciated about this film is that it is funny. And sure, it is a copy of the first film, but if you really like that first film and just want more of that, well, that's exactly what you're going to get. Because like that last film, you're going to get that same barrage of jokes of every different type, one after another. And I have to admit, a lot of them are just as laugh-out-loud funny as the jokes from the first film. This movie opens with a familiar Star Wars crawl and the original airplane theme music, and our cast approaching the familiar Los Angeles International Airport, and we get the same lightning-fast barrage of unrelating jokes, and it does have the same feeling of the first movie. In fact, even legendary critic Roger Ebert said that he was impressed by the first one-third of the movie and the frenetic rapid-fire barrage of jokes. So much that he thought it could be a worthy sequel to the first airplane movie. However, he quickly became disappointed. And I do agree with the first one-third of the film. It does effectively capture the same humor and the same level and quality of the humor as the first airplane movie. Now, rather than a flight from LAX to Chicago, we get a commercial space shuttle flight from LAX to the moon. And in the airport, David Leisure, who was famous in the 1980s for his Joe Isuzu character, reprising his role as a Hare Krishna and now working the counter for Transcendental Airlines. And remember, our plane was Pan Am in the first movie. Well, here, our airplane is going to outer space, so its name is Pan Universe. And working at the counter is Norm Peterson actor George Wendt. And this is not a cameo, this is actually before his role as Norm Peterson on Cheers. This was simply an early role he took, since Cheers would premiere in the same year, only a few months later. And as we enter the control tower, we see that a kid takes over the controls and starts playing it like a video game, and the sound effects for the video game come from the Atari 2600 video game Yar's Revenge, and then he blows up an incoming shuttle. And I always found this scene very disturbing, since this movie is about saving one shuttle, but the movie already starts with one shuttle and all the people on board having been completely killed. On the ground, Chuck Connors discovers the wires are faulty and realizes that Ted Stryker was set up. And Chuck Connors' character is a parody of George Kennedy's ground expert character in the Airport series, who always seems to know everything about what's going on with the flight. And Chuck Connors continues the tradition of having serious actors play deadpan roles in the airplane films. And Chuck Connors is best known for his role as the rifleman in the hit TV series that ran from 1958 to 1963, although he'd been in over 100 roles before being in Airplane 2. And Chuck Connors, back in the 1940s, Connors, who was 6'6", played both professional baseball for the Brooklyn Dodgers and played professional basketball for the Boston Celtics. He remains only one of 13 athletes in the history of professional sports to have played both professional baseball and professional basketball. Now, the plot of this film is that Ted Stryker found out that the space shuttle mission to the moon is not ready and is too dangerous. But the corporate heads are so eager for a successful flight that they lock Stryker up in a mental institution and proceed with the flight. A flight that Elaine and her new fiancé, Simon, will be on. And to further complicate the plot, Sonny Bono has purchased a bomb at the airport gift store with a plan to blow up the shuttle and himself in order to get insurance money for his wife. So, just like in the first movie, Ted Stryker buys a scalp ticket on the flight to get on board. And in the cockpit, we get the return of pilot Captain Over, played by Peter Graves, and we get another scene with Captain Over saying inappropriate things to a little kid. So here you see that it is such a blatant ripoff of the first movie that I actually thought it was an intentional meta statement. And a part of me still likes to believe that it really was, rather than to think that this was just some cheap cash grab. And of course we get the familiar flashback sequence, but in this film, the flashback is a flashback to the last movie, and I thought that was pretty clever. We also get the return of a lot of cast members from the first Airplane film. We get the U-Band Coffee Lady, we get Al White, one of the men who speak jive, and we get the kindly couple. We also get the return of the old lady who sits next to Ted Stryker and gets annoyed at his incessant talking. And we get Ann Nelson reprising her role as the old lady sitting next to Ted Stryker. And while she hung herself in the last movie, here she vomits while hearing Ted Stryker's story. Now, whereas Poison Fish was the villain in the last movie, here the navigational computer Rock, a play on HAL from 2001, A Space Odyssey. And Rock decides to take over and destroy the crew and all the passengers. And it turns out that the Mayflower shuttle was not ready for spaceflight, and Ted Stryker was right all along, and he was set up. And Elaine realizes that she made a huge mistake to abandon Ted for Simon. We also get the return of Lloyd Bridges reprising his role as Captain McCroskey, and another returning cast member is Steven Stucker, the wacky tower assistant who played Johnny in the first movie, plays Jacobs here.
Death trap!
In the first Airplane, we really got to know the stewardesses, such as Lorna Patterson playing the other stewardess. But in this movie, we didn't really get to know who the other stewardess was. The other stewardess was Mary, played by Wendy Phillips, and in some deleted scenes, we see that she actually had more of a substantial role in this movie. And in a deleted scene, we see that Steve McCroskey, played by Lloyd Bridges, who was apparently admitted to a psychiatric hospital after the events of the last film. And when McCroskey gets a call from the airport, one of the nurses says, "It's okay, he just thinks he's Lloyd Bridges." And when she wakes McCroskey up, he's got a snorkel, which is a reference to Lloyd Bridges' other famous role in Sea Hunt. The music played during the shuttle launch is from Battlestar Galactica, and the navigator is played by Kent McCord, who played Captain Troy on Galactica 1980. Elaine informs the passengers that they've traveled off by millions of miles, that asteroids are hitting the hull of the ship, and that the navigational computer has malfunctioned. And the passengers accept all this calmly, but when she informs them that they're out of coffee, the airplane riots. Now, I may not have gotten this joke as a kid, but as an adult coffee addict, I can appreciate this joke much better now. A few months before becoming the host of Wheel of Fortune, Pat Sajak has a small role as a news reporter.
Also in the news, lunar shuttle heads for the sun and certain disaster.
Now, when I was watching this, when Elaine's fiancé Simon literally turns into jelly, I always thought that was a very disturbing image. At first, Stryker refuses to fly a plane, and little Jimmy walks up to Ted Stryker with a cream pie and sits next to him, and he asks,
"Can I ask you a question?"
What is it?
It's an interrogative statement used to test knowledge.
And when he asks if his dog will be okay, this inspires Stryker to fly the shuttle to safety, and when he gets up, he smashes the kid's face into the pie. And it's such a stupid gag, but it always makes me laugh. Ted goes to the cockpit and decides to save everyone, and Elaine professes her love for Ted. And then Elaine says,
I have the strangest feeling we've been through this exact same thing before.
and this is a writing technique where you openly admit the flaw that you feel the audience may be catching on to. Done well, it can be very satisfying and cancel and prevent the audience from being pulled out of the film. An example of this being done very well was Back to the Future 2, when Griff's gang chases Marty through the town square. Biff looks on and says, "There's something very familiar about this." And I think it works well enough here.
Stryker, 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 Stryker! Ted Stryker?
So the Mayflower shuttle is heading straight for the sun, and they have another problem. Sonny Bono is planning to destroy the Mayflower with his bomb. And this is so crazy that we get Sonny Bono, Cher's ex-husband, half of the 1970s super team of Sonny and Cher, the future mayor of Palm Springs and U.S. congressman for California. And when they retrieve the bomb, they have a plan to use the bomb to destroy Rock and regain control of the shuttle. The destination of the Mayflower shuttle is Luna Base Alpha Beta, which may be a reference to the science fiction series Space 1999, which took place on a very similar Moonbase Alpha. Robert Stack was asked to reprise his role as Rex Kramer. However, after reading the script, he thought the script was weak and turned it down. And this time, rather than Rex Kramer, we get Buck Murdoch, the man who flew with Ted Stryker during the war. And in a bizarre bit of inspired casting, Buck Murdoch is played by William Shatner. And he is hilarious in this role, and most audiences at the time were really surprised by how funny William Shatner really was. And with his introduction, we get a barrage of at least 10 jokes in a 2-minute period. And as I'm watching it today, some of the jokes are really making me laugh out loud. And in a scene where he looks into a periscope and sees the Starship Enterprise, after all, Paramount owns both Airplane and Star Trek. But here's a weird bit of trivia. This is the first and last time in the history of cinema that the original USS Enterprise was featured on the big screen. And there's also a nice television connection between William Shatner and Lee Bryant, who played the U-Bahn coffee lady. The two worked together on the TV series T.J. Hooker, where Lee Bryant had a recurring role on that series as T.J. Hooker's ex-wife Fran. So when Ted Stryker asks Elaine for a screwdriver, she hands him an orange juice and vodka, and here we learn that Ted still has his drinking problem. The man who cuts himself shaving in the bathroom is Craig Berenson, who was in the first Airplane movie as the man who gets mauled by Rex Kramer's dog. Ted lands the shuttle, but not before destroying the bridge of the moon base, Alpha Beta. And I'm still surprised to learn that Zaz did not have any part of this film, because it's interesting to follow the career of Zaz after their star-making turn directing the first Airplane movie, and what they chose to do instead of Airplane 2. Because their next project would be the TV show Police Squad in 1982, which despite excellent reviews was canceled after 6 episodes. But then in 1984, Zaz released their next film, a parody similar to Airplane, but making fun of spy and war movies, and it was called Top Secret, featuring Val Kilmer in his first role, which I really liked at the time, but was a huge disappointment at the box office. And their next project was a very interesting choice. It was a Danny DeVito and Bette Midler comedy, more grounded in reality, called Ruthless People, and it was a critical and commercial success, allowing Zaz to write their own tickets in Hollywood. David Zucker would go on to make the Naked Gun franchise, started in 1988, which would lead to Naked Gun 2.5, The Smell of Fear, and he would take over the Scary Movie franchise. Jim Abrams would create the similarly wacky Hot Shots franchise, which was to Top Gun and Rambo action movies, what Airplane did to the airport disaster films. And the most interesting career trajectory goes to Jerry Zucker, who took a more serious directorial turn. He directed the 1990 uber hit Ghost, starring Patrick Swayze and Demi Moore, and he would go on to direct First Night, the King Arthur movie starring Sean Connery as King Arthur, and Richard Gere as Lancelot. Now, this film did not do as well as the first movie and was generally met with negative reviews. And as for the box office, it was disappointing as well. Made on a budget of $15 million, it did make a slight profit with a disappointing $27 million, and therefore it killed any chances of an actual Airplane 3, which was in production before Paramount pulled the plug due to the poor box office of Airplane 2. Well, that ends my quick look on Airplane 2, the sequel. Please check out my other videos on Star Trek, James Bond, on the Rocky series, and I have other comedies like Caddyshack coming soon. Well, that ends this video. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you had a great time.